Hello, and welcome to Youth Sunday School. I'm Kayla, the Director of Youth Ministries at First United Methodist Church. Today we're going to look at a passage from Matthew chapter 22, verses 34 to 40. Here it is. Let's read it together. When the Pharisees heard that Jesus had left the Sadducees speechless, they met together. One of them, a legal expert, tested him. "Teacher, what is the greatest commandment in the law?" He replied, "You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your being, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. You must love your neighbor as you love yourself. All the law and the prophets depend on these two commands." Have you heard this one before? Because I've heard this one before about a gajillion times. A lot of people boil our faith down to love God and love neighbor, and it's a pretty simple rule to live by. And it's efficient because Jesus says that all the law and the prophets depend on those two commands, to love God and to love neighbor. So it's a good starting point, and this is where that comes from. It wouldn't be Youth Sunday School without context. So, Matthew! Matthew is one of the four Gospels, with a capital G, the books of the Bible that tell the story of Jesus' birth, life, ministry, death, and resurrection. Gospel with a capital G is one of the books of the Bible, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. If you spell gospel with a tiny g, it's just a word that means good news. Pharisees. Pharisees were one of several factions of the Jewish people during Jesus' time. So if you think vaguely like denominations, Methodists and Presbyterians and Lutherans and whatnot, it's kind of like that. Not exactly, though. Pharisees were one of several factions of the Jewish people during Jesus' time, made up mostly of more common people, that is, like people who aren't wealthy aristocrats or priests at the temple. The Pharisees highly valued the law given to them by God and often challenged Jesus for breaking the religious laws or rules throughout his ministry. It makes sense that people who value laws and rules would be upset with people who break the laws and rules, as the Pharisees were often upset with Jesus. Next word, Sadducees. The Sadducees were another of several factions of Jewish people during Jesus' life. They were part of the upper class, so made up of more wealthy and more in control of places of power like the temple, which meant that the temple priests who focused on and valued temple rituals were Sadducees. And then another fun fact, another major group that I feel like I just wanted to share with you all was the Essenes. That's another faction of Jewish people. They basically said, "We're tired of the Sadducees and the Pharisees." And they left Jerusalem to live in the desert and practiced minimalist monastic lifestyles. Think of like how John the Baptist lived, wearing animal skins and eating locusts and bugs and berries and nuts. Oh, this one is my favorite context. The word being. In the Common English Bible, which is what we're reading, it's translated as being. In the New Revised Standard Version, it gets translated as soul. And I went to look up the original Hebrew word because I'm always interested when a Hebrew word gets translated as different words in English. And the Hebrew word is napsika. I think I've pronounced that correctly. It's usually translated as either soul or life throughout the Bible where that word is found. And so you could also read it as with all your soul, with all your life. Either of those are also another way to translate it, and it kind of helps us understand what our souls are. Our next piece of context is a footnote. Footnote, that little yellow C there. This is a reference to Deuteronomy chapter 6 verse 5, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your being, and all your strength." This is where that Hebrew word I just mentioned comes from, napsika. And Jesus is quoting scripture here. Quoting scripture and quoting the law back to people who really love the law. And so he kind of surprises them because they think he's a rule breaker not following the rules, and it turns out Jesus knows all the rules and is just kind of breaking them anyway. And then there's one more footnote, footnote D, and in this one Jesus is quoting Leviticus chapter 19 verse 18, which says, "You must not take revenge nor hold a grudge against any of your people. Instead you must love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord." So that's another scripture quote that Jesus is bringing up. He's reciting another of the laws. So what you're saying is love God with your whole self, right? It's not hard. Well, not exactly. We're looking at it in three different ways. Loving God in three different ways, not just your whole self. I think if Jesus meant love God with your whole self, he would have said love with your whole self, but the fact that he specified heart and soul and mind might mean something. Okay? On the one hand, yes, you could summarize it as love God with your whole self. But on the other hand, Jesus didn't say love God with your whole self. Jesus said, love the Lord with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind, which suggests to me that maybe there's different ways of loving God. So what does it mean to love God with all of your heart? I think we understand this one pretty well. When we think of love, we think of our hearts. We think about love coming from the heart, and we understand it as kind of a feeling of like closeness or intimacy with another person or with a place. A lot of times love from the heart is associated with our feelings of love. What does it mean to love God with all of your soul? Well, we know the Hebrew word napsaka is translated as soul, is translated as life, is translated as being. And so altogether, those words kind of just mean like loving God with your life, loving God with whatever it is that makes you alive in the first place and gives you breath, loving God with the core of what makes you human, the core of what makes you alive, loving God with that. What does it mean to love God with all of your mind? This one was my favorite thought that I had this week when I heard this scripture again and really paid attention. Because I think we often boil down our faith to our spirituality and how we feel about God and the love that we give to God in our devotion and our caring. But to love God with our minds is to think about God, to think about who God is, to ask questions about God, to wonder things about God, sometimes even to have doubt about God. And none of that is bad. Spending time thinking about God, I think giving that time with our minds to God and thinking about God and who God is all a form of loving God. Thinking is good. That's what I have for you all today. Alright, I hope you all have a great week. I love you all, and make sure to check in with me and let me know how you're doing.